Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me once again Daniel McAdams of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Welcome, Daniel, and thanks for joining me again.
Hi, Jay. It's so good to talk to you again.
It is really good to catch up with you again, and we haven't talked much recently, but a lot has changed since you and I last spoke, in the Middle East especially. Russia and Iran have come together to aid Assad in Syria. And with that, it seems as though the U.S. has lost some of its influence in the Middle East. Would you agree that that's the case?
I think that is the case, and I think it's primarily because, by all measurements, the less than 1 month old Russian military operation against the extremists in Syria has been far more effective than a year of U.S. bombing. And so I think, these kinds of things speak louder than words, really. Mm-hmm. And I think Russian action in Syria has gotten the attention of not only the Syrians, but certainly the Iranians, as you point out, but also the Iraqis, and further east, the Afghanis are also paying attention. So I think there's sort of a sense of a geopolitical shift, and I don't want to be too dramatic about it, but I do certainly have the sense that with the change of the facts on the ground, the sort of broader, as we say, geopolitical facts are also changing, and they're not changing in Washington's favor as far as being the leader of the world and the exceptional nation. And I think it's just simply a function of the U.S. policymakers falling victim to believing their own propaganda and left wondering why things didn't work out the way the propagandists promised that they would. Mm-hmm. So things have, I think, definitely changed in the past 2 or 3 weeks, Jay.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit like the Federal Reserve propaganda in the economic sphere as well, just believing it and continuing to do things even when it doesn't work. Well, I wonder, why do you think has Russia become more aggressive in helping Syria now? I mean, they've been on Syria's side for so long. Do you think the refugee situation has something to do with it, or what do you think might have triggered Putin and Russia to come together with Iran to come to the aid of Assad?
Well, I think we should remember that Russia has had, I guess I should say the Soviet Union, has had a naval base in Syria since, I think, 1957. So the Russians/Soviets and Syrians have been allies for a very long time. This is not some sort of a new alliance. What happened to trigger the latest Russian military activity, which I must admit I was surprised to see direct Russian involvement, but what triggered this was a request from Assad: we need you to help us take care of this problem. But I think the deeper factor for the Russians was they, I believe, had a sense that Assad was about to go. His military has been fighting a horrific war for the past 4 years. They're very tired. Whereas the ISIS and the Al Qaeda have had a constant influx of new troops from around the world. The Syrian army has just had itself to rely on, so they're very tired. I think the refugee crisis had something to do with it, but I think the Russians saw the imminent collapse of Assad, and I think they also sniffed a little bit of U.S./Turk/Saudi actual intervention, physical intervention at the heels of Assad's collapse. And I think that might have been informed slightly by what happened in Libya, where when they didn't go in, Libya became an absolute disaster. Mm-hmm. I think, and this is my surmising, but I think the U.S. planned to actually lead some sort of a ground operation after Assad was gone. And I think the Russians saw that once the facts were changed on the ground with U.S. action, they would have almost zero room for maneuver. Mm-hmm. So that's my suspicion as to the origin. But the fact of the matter is and remains, no matter what you think of him, Assad is a legitimate, internationally recognized ruler of Syria. And when the head of a sovereign state requests an ally to provide assistance, that, according to international law, is a perfectly legal and acceptable thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, it certainly makes sense. What would have happened to Russia, let's say, if Assad had fallen and the U.S. had gained some control of that country, or at least messed it up so badly that Russia was chased out?
It would have been a strategic setback to Russia, I think, definitely. Mm-hmm. But in more practical terms, Russia saw thousands of jihadist fighters that had escaped not only from Russia, but from countries bordering on Russia to go and fight in Syria. And these people had become not only radicalized theologically, but had become trained in military tactics and techniques. And I think Russia was terrified, especially after problems with Chechnya and everything in the Caucasus for a number of years. They were terrified of these people coming back home, and who knows what would have happened. So I think there was certainly a matter of their own national interest at stake in their decision as well.
You and I have talked about ISIS in our discussions before, and you've talked about how in some cases the U.S. was actually using ISIS as an ally, and other times it was killing ISIS and trying to destroy them. Putin has left it be known, in fact, that anything they can help, they're not going. If they can help it, they're not going to allow radical Muslims to get into their country. Do you think that Putin is being more effective in the fight against radical Islamics than the West has been, or the US and NATO has been?
Well, I think that the Russians have more direct experience with the consequences. We had 9/11, which was a tragedy, but the Russians have had a number of terrorist attacks that have been undertaken by radicalized Muslims.
Yeah.
In many in Moscow, many bombings. So they are more acutely aware of it, and I think they feel more of an existential threat because Russia is, to a large degree, a Muslim country. They have an enormous Muslim population.
Right.
And so I think there certainly is matters of concern. But what always makes me laugh, Jay, is especially the neocons back here. They say, Russia just went in there to prop up their ally Assad. Okay, well, they have an alliance with Assad, but doesn't the U.S. have an alliance with Israel and Egypt, for that matter? Wouldn't we go in and quote prop up Israel if they were under attack from an Arab neighbor that looked like they were about to overthrow Israel? Of course, that's the nature of alliances.
Sure.
It's neither good nor bad. It just is.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is sort of this hypocrisy that we are the only ones allowed to have allies. Mm-hmm. No one else is allowed to have interests unless they coincide with ours. And the world doesn't work that way, and the world becomes resentful when the U.S. expects it to work that way.
Right. I guess it's a little bit like the nuclear bomb. We'll decide who has the right to have it and who doesn't. And, of course, we're the only nation that ever used it so far.
Exactly, Jay.
So it's, I don't know why we can so easily overlook that. But, who besides Israel and Saudi Arabia? I guess maybe Egypt is an ally of the United States. But how firm do you think, aside from Israel, how firm do you think Saudi Arabia or Egypt, for that matter, might be as allies to us?
Well, what's interesting that I noticed is, Egypt is now ruled by a military dictatorship, and that's because the Arab Spring that the U.S. was behind didn't quite produce the results that it wanted. It produced a Muslim Brotherhood-led government, which the U.S. was opposed to. So now we back a military dictator. But which was very interesting, and I think this does also suggest a larger geopolitical shift, is that the Egyptians have chimed in favor of Russian airstrikes on Syria.
Oh, interesting.
And that directly goes against the U.S. And also U.S. allies, some would say U.S. puppet, Jordan, has also signaled agreement with some Russian moves in Syria. So this U.S. idea that we have all of these countries in our back pocket, the arrogance that goes along with that, can very easily crumble when circumstances change, and it looks like there might be a new kid on the block.
Very interesting. Well, with the loss of influence in the Middle East, how are the neocons reacting to that, Daniel? I noticed there were a couple of articles at the Ron Paul Institute website where Secretary of Defense is saying that the United States military, we've got to start putting men on the ground in Syria. I mean, are we looking to have a hand-to-hand combat with Russia and with Iranian soldiers, or what?
But just think about this, Jay, and I don't think it's any surprise to anyone how really everyone thinks that the neocons are so pro-America and pro-military. They hate the military. They despise these soldiers. They think they're just a bunch of boobs.
Yeah.
And if anyone doubts that, just think of this idea that they're going to put American soldiers on the ground, huddled together with these rebels that the Russians are actively bombing. You know, the Russians have said, if you have moderates there, give us the coordinates so we won't bomb them. And the U.S. said, we're not going to talk to you.
Wow.
So instead, we're going to put American troops there to have Russian bombs fall on them.
Well, then that would give us an excuse to go to war with Russia, wouldn't it?
Which what the neocons would I probably love more than anything else.
Right. Didn't Chris Christie suggest that's what we should do?
Yeah, and McCain and Lindsey Graham and all of these creeps, you know, that's exactly what they want. It won't affect them, or so they think, until a nuclear bomb goes off in Washington.
Yes.
You know, but they're just crazed. And so the question is what their reaction is. Their reaction, as usual, is just to double down. You know, we need to have more weapons over there. We need to put troops on the ground. Yeah. But what's interesting about what Secretary Carter said about putting U.S. troops, we may have to have some ground operations in Syria and Iraq, is that less than 24 hours after Carter said that, the Iraqis called up and said, whoa, hold on a minute. We don't want American troops. We don't want Iraq invasion 3.0. We've got enough troops. Thank you very much.
Wow.
Please don't. Please don't.
Wow.
And that follows up on what happened the previous week, where the Iraqis were thinking of asking the Russians to help out with some bombing of ISIS in Iraq. And the U.S. sent, I think they sent the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff over to twist some arms and say, you better not do this. If you do this, we're not going to help you. He came home and said, okay, we convinced the Iraqis not to do it. A couple of days later, the Iraqi parliament voted to allow Russia to bomb ISIS on Russian territory. So you have Iraq also falling by the wayside, not wanting U.S. troops and asking the Russians to get involved.
Wow, with all that blood and treasury that we have expended, and now even Iraq is against us. It's incredible. It's an incredible failure in the Middle East of not just this president's policy, but of course laying the groundwork for this disaster was the previous president. How
ungrateful they are! You know, we went and bombed their country to smithereens.
Yeah, I mean, why shouldn't they be thankful? We only killed how many 100,000 of people? Why shouldn't they love us for that? Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, it's really sad. I just one more thought I want to ask you about, because we're going to have Richard Mayberry on this show after the commercial break, but and we're going to talk about geopolitics as well. But one of the things I was wondering, Daniel, you know, we're seeing more and more as the U.S. seems to have lost its influence in the Middle East, it's projecting its presence in the South China Sea more, and China left it be known that it doesn't like that very much. Do you think there might be some sort of trying to make up for what's being lost in the Middle East? Do you think the U.S. may be looking to project its power and to hold China down? I mean, after all, you know, we've left it be known we don't like them building their islands there, and we've just put together the TPP, which I believe is probably meant to try to get countries not to form too strong commercial alliances with China, to sort of isolate China if we can, so we can retain our power and presence in that part of the world. But do you have any thoughts about what might be going on there?
Well, I think the argument that the U.S. had for last week, its incursion into the 12-mile exclusion zone around these reefs that China is building up, is that we've got to protect the sea lanes. We've got to protect international commerce, which really doesn't make much sense when you think about the fact that through the South China Sea travels 80% of Chinese trade. Mm-hmm. So why on earth would the Chinese want to hinder global trade or sea lanes in any way, shape, or form? And Jay, we did a Ron Paul Liberty Report segment on this very topic last week, and Dr. Paul, I think, made a very good point that if all they were trying to do is to make sure they wanted to keep the sea lanes open, to make sure to let them know that we want to keep running goods and services through this area, why would they send a fully equipped warship? Right. Why not send a ship carrying some items or some goods, or a trading ship? Mm-hmm. It's obviously saber rattling, and the Chinese have built up 2 islands in that area. There are other countries. I think it was Thailand, I believe, one of the other countries in the area. They built up 48 islands. Wow. Other countries have built up 4 or 5 or 6. So everyone is doing it. They're all battling over this area. The only difference is that the U.S. wants to come in and throw its weight around. It would be another thing if China was blockading trade, if it was doing something of that nature,
Yeah.
that would be a whole different story. But they've
Sure.
shown no indication that they're interested in doing that.
Right.
On the contrary, they want to facilitate trade.
Right.
That's their bread and butter. Otherwise, they're toast.
Well, I guess Thailand and other countries, as long as they go along with the program of the neocons and the NATO alliance, I guess the United States, the large corporate interests that want to control things, then I guess we'll let them build their islands. But if they want to practice their own sovereignty and remain independent, then we don't want that to happen, because it looks as though, I guess, nothing new in history, Daniel. If we go through history, we would find this is nothing new. Empires try to grab as much as they can, and they outspend themselves. They put themselves into debt, and then ultimately they sort of suffocate themselves. I'm afraid that's maybe what's happening. But anyway, I thank you very much for your insights on all these matters, Daniel. Much appreciated. And all the best to you. And folks, please support the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Go there and check out Daniel's work. Ron Paul is there all the time, and lots of other great contributors. So go to the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity and follow all that Daniel and his group of people are doing. Thank you, Daniel.